real food and exercise. Everyone that's ever used that approach has died, right? So, but there's got to be a deeper layer. What are the biomarkers of this cachexic phenotype where you're just decaying, you're still alive, but you're basically literally dying and decaying and decomposing over a 10 or 15 year period?
Michael, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Siim. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you back. And this is our third episode, or even fourth, I think. I always have you back. So because we never go into, all the details that we want to talk about. So we need separate episodes for different topics. And this time we wanted to talk about Bloodwork, which I think, you and I agree that it is one of the most important things for your, let's say, longevity potential. So like if knowing which direction are you heading in, like are you heading in the wrong direction or in the right direction? And Bloodwork is kind of, reflection of your inner health as well. What is your, philosophy when it comes to blood markers, and how would you prioritize it?
Yeah, perfect first question. So let's frame it as the health and potentially longevity hierarchy optimization, right? So I see body composition, right? So leanness, relatively low body fat, low visceral fat, relatively high bone mineral density. But then it's not just one time point. It's avoiding age-related changes, right? So loss of lean mass, resisting age-related increase for body fat and visceral fat, decline for bone mineral density, right? That's at the top of the hierarchy, optimizing that. Also physical fitness, right? VO2 max, grip strength. And then, as a harder to measure aspect, cognitive function, right? Because who wants to be fit and lean and then cognitively, right? So, but that's a harder thing to measure, right? So at the top of the pyramid is leanness and fitness, right? But this has been the approach forever, right? Just eat real food and exercise. And everyone that's ever used that approach has died, right? So I'm not saying I'm going to be the first to break that mold, but there's got to be a deeper layer, right? So this is going to be a long-winded answer. I hope I don't lose anyone, but anyway, it's important to get out there, right? So then if we look under the hood, right, then let's look at just using blood biomarkers as an example, because there are things like blood pressure, so vascular health, lung function, how strong is your forced exhalation, just as one example, that are not included in blood biomarkers, but they're obvious important measures of organ and systemic health that get worse with aging, right? So that's also on the list. I don't want people to think, oh, it's only blood biomarkers. Is far from the truth, right? It's hierarchy at the top and then subdividing into all of the biomarkers of as many organ systems as possible. So with that in mind, where to start, right? So blood would be a good representation of without taking tissue biopsies, right? I can't imagine any of us is going to go in 8 times a year and pull muscle or pull liver. This is just unreasonable, right? So, so then in terms of looking at a blood sample, about 45% of it is red blood cells, right? So obviously looking at red blood cell markers, whether it's total red blood cells, the size of red blood cells, which is the MCV, the variation in the size of the red blood cells, which is the RDW, which I'm sure you know and maybe others may know is an important predictor of longevity, at least in mice. And the data in humans matches the data in mice, which suggests it could be a marker of longevity in people too, a dramatically underrated marker of longevity. And then hemoglobin, right, which declines during aging. It's your oxygen carrying capacity. So all of those red blood cell measures would be basically, second tier, where, because it's such a huge fraction of blood and a major cell type, we want to be measuring those biomarkers. And then slightly above that are the white blood cells, right, at 1% of the total blood volume. So that doesn't mean that red blood cells are 45 times more important than white blood cells. It's just dissecting everything in blood and trying to measure the biggest trees in the forest, right? So white blood cells, but then white blood cells can be further subdivided. They don't all move in the same directions. So neutrophils and monocytes increase during aging, lymphocytes decrease during aging. So we want to keep our eyes on those 3 because that's about 95% of total white blood cells. We want to keep an eye on those 3 over time. And it isn't just one time point. It's making sure that the neutrophils and monocytes aren't increasing and the lymphocytes aren't decreasing. All right, so now we got the cells, and also platelets are in that list too. Right, so now we got the cells. We covered that in the blood. So now we've got the plasma fraction, right, where you've got proteins, metabolites, and then So just starting with the proteins, right? So we could jump straight into things like cystatin C as a marker of kidney health, or CRP, inflammatory markers, CRP, IL-6, TNF alpha. But the way I look at this is I'm trying to go after the biggest trees in the forest. For me, it makes sense that optimizing the biggest trees would have the biggest impact long term. So what are the biggest trees in the blood forest, right? So most of us are focused on glucose and lipids, lipoproteins, right? But just to put it into perspective, glucose is 80 milligrams per deciliter. Albumin is 4,500 milligrams per deciliter, right? So
Mm.
albumin, by far, in terms of concentration, is way more than glucose and even lipoproteins, right? If total cholesterol is, say, 200 milligrams per deciliter versus 4,500 milligrams per deciliter for albumin. So albumin, for sure, is a big tree in the forest that
Mm.
is almost always ignored or underrated, right? But then also you've got the globulins, which can be subdivided too into IgG, which a recent paper showed is associated with longevity if you keep it relatively low. CR can reduce it, exercise can reduce it, parabiosis reduces it. Globulins can be up to 2,500 to 3,000 milligrams per deciliter. So again, putting that 2,500 to 3,000 versus the 80 for glucose or 200 for total cholesterol, globulins are a big tree. And then also looking at fibrinogen, right? So fibrinogen, 250 milligrams per deciliter, which again is 3 times higher around for glucose and then also higher than. So those are the biggest protein trees in the blood forest. Now, does that mean things like cystatin C, which is 0.7 milligrams per liter, or 70 micrograms per deciliter, is less important? No, there are low abundance proteins in blood like CRP, cystatin C, TNF alpha, IL-6, which are in microgram to even picogram, so 10 to the negative 6, 10 to the negative 12 in terms of grams, that are in very low abundance, can be very important for tracking during aging. So I'm not putting all of my eggs in the low abundance proteins. I'm looking at the big trees in the forest while also including some of the lower abundance stuff. And then last but not least are the metabolites, right? So technically glucose falls into that category. The lipoproteins fall into that category. Cholesterol is a metabolite. But then also looking at, quote unquote, novel cutting edge metabolites, kynurenine divided by tryptophan, EPA and DHA, which may be important for inflammation and a whole host of stuff. But even those metabolites, creatinine is a metabolite, right? So I'm also doing metabolomics at every test and really trying to map that in terms of, optimizing multiple biomarkers over time.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, like I guess yeah, like people don't think about like if you look at the blood, then how big of a percentage is a certain marker there. Like you said, glucose is actually like a fairly small percentage of the total blood in like a vial. But yeah, like it's still like it's predictive of a lot of like chronic diseases like diabetes and those kind of things. So yeah, like I guess yeah, you still need to like look at all of them or like as much as possible, and some of them might have like bigger prediction value. And I guess it could be also that most of this there's a lot more studies done on cholesterol and glucose and certain like testosterone and these very common markers, and almost or very little studies done on actual of these red blood cells or white blood cell types.
There's a lot of published data on red blood cells and the MCV, all of that stuff. It's there, it exists. It's just,
Compared to like glucose and
yeah,
cholesterol.
yeah, yeah. In terms of what's published, for sure, more is. I wouldn't say more is known though. It's just more of the spotlight is on glucose and the lipids, right?
Mm.
And for rightly so, because metabolic health is related to cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause, one of the top 5 leading causes of death, depending on where you are in terms of age. Which then highlights another issue too. Can we look at biomarkers of each of the top 5 causes of death in centenarians, right? So what's optimal for lowest risk for CVD, for cancer, for respiratory diseases, for Alzheimer's disease? What are the biomarkers that we can do to keep those comorbidities low, right? So for sure, metabolic health is a part of that strategy, but there are a lot of other biomarkers that also feed into that story.
Mm. What would be like of course, measuring a lot of biomarkers is also very expensive, and especially do it like frequently. What do you think are like the lowest hanging fruit, like maybe like a dozen or something like that of biomarkers that everyone should kind of measure at least like once a year?
Yeah. So the standard, I'd say once a year is probably too little. And,
Mm.
I'm testing now 8 times a year. So even that, I could say that's too little. I may have mentioned this on other podcasts with you or others, but, 8 times a year is still 357 days that I don't know what the data is, right? I'm
Mm.
assuming that once every 6 to 8 weeks is representative of that period, but is it, right? So, but then things like blood pressure or lung function, blowing into the spirometer, I can do that daily. So that's a more accurate representation. Eventually, the field has got to get to the point where it's whatever I'm peeing out or pooing out, that's giving me some more accurate representation of day-to-day change. And then that'll really supercharge all of this. All right. So in terms of the basics, even just the standard chemistry panel and complete blood count, which is a $35 USD test, it gives you the white blood cells and differentials, the red blood cells, liver, kidney, glucose, lipids. That's the foundation for me. I started on that. And then if you add things in like HSCRP, now we're at an $80 USD test. But then you would miss things like you mentioned, testosterone, DHEA, sulfate, androgens decline hardcore during aging. So ignoring and not tracking that, most people are just going to be on that age-related decline and not even know it until probably it's too late. And then how do you get it back? Is TRT replacement therapy, is that the way you want to go? I don't know about everybody else, but I'm trying to keep my system as youthful as possible so I don't have to take these exogenous agents, and basically reproduce what health looks like.
Hmm. Yeah. um, but I guess then the question is also like, you fix the blood marker, right, with, let's say, TRT, but does that actually represent systemic improvement in health? Is it like, are you optimizing the health or are you optimizing the blood marker? What do you think? Like, because you can like kind of hack or game a lot of these blood markers, even in the short term with whatever, like even some supplements or pharmaceuticals. So what do you think?
Yeah, for sure. So I see that two ways. One is if testosterone is a certain number and you take it exogenously, now you get it at that certain number, but the mechanisms involved in leading to the decreased testosterone aren't fixed, then I'd say that that's the suboptimal approach. Actually, the worst approach is doing nothing, right? You don't
Hmm.
even know what your testosterone is 50 years later. It's 250 or whatever, or less, right? You're just on the age-related decline. Uh, Taking it exogenously after ignoring it for decades, obviously going to be better than that, but you then don't address the root cause. So I'm always trying to get after root cause if I can. And we're talking like sometimes even 20 tests later, I'm still looking for root cause to see if I can fix it. And then if I can't, worst case, okay, I'll take it exogenously. Like my thyroid hormones have been garbage since my 20s. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism, sonogram by an endocrinologist. So no matter what I do, I still can't optimize my free T3 to free T4 ratio. So now I'm considering having to take exogenous T3 instead of T4 because my conversion is bad for whatever reason. So for whatever reason, I can't fix the endogenous production or conversion. So in that case, endogenous would be important. So for me, I'm a root causes guy, but I think most people don't look at it like that. They're like, I'm looking for the optimal number, and they don't even address root cause. Which is going to be more beneficial for health and longevity? I mean, I'd bet on the person who's got the most youthful milieu for the longest period of time and taking as little of the exogenous agents only until they have to, late or latest in life.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think at some point, to dramatically extend lifespan, you need to do something that is not natural. So yeah, like at some point there needs to be some intervention. I want to take a quick break to let you know that you can now get my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. It contains 24 chapters ranging from the biology of aging to all the major chronic diseases such as heart disease, kidney disease, neurodegeneration, and I also cover over 70 clinically relevant biomarkers for chronic diseases and their optimal ranges. You can get the book from the link in the description. Yeah, maybe we can move on with some of like these more conventional blood markers that people know about, like cholesterol or blood sugar and inflammation and those things. So there's a lot of blood markers that predict the risk of heart disease and diabetes and kidney disease, and they all like interlap with each other to a certain extent. Like diabetes increases kidney disease risk, and kidney disease risk increases heart disease risk, etc. So do you have like any set of markers that you would like prioritize for like this cardiovascular slash metabolic health?
Yeah, I mean the standards are pretty good. I mean glucose, HbA1c. It's hard to include insulin in that because insulin levels can be low in, or obviously are low in youth, but also advanced age. So then it becomes, and they peak in early life. So now you've got this inverted U. So you've got a lot of people measuring insulin, not you, but there are a lot of people measuring. Well, I mean you've measured it too, but and me too. There are a lot of people measuring insulin who will say, "Oh, my insulin is 3 milli IUs per mil," and they're like, "This is great." But because insulin is an inverse U, how would you know if it's youthful or aged, right? And with advanced age, there's pancreatic beta cell failure, not producing insulin when you need it, right? So it goes back to that question of how would you know if that's youthful or aged, right? So I find that looking at if glucose is increasing during age with a low insulin, clearly bad. That's insulin resistance. HbA1c clearly increasing during aging, insulin resistance. So I don't find the most value in looking at insulin, but glucose, HbA1c, obviously. But then, the lipoproteins. So whether it's looking at LDL, VLDL, HDL without ApoB, we're looking at, and lipoprotein A, we're looking at only ApoB. I mean, right now I'm doing the experiment where I'm looking at all of that to see if I can only use ApoB as a surrogate for non-HDL cholesterol. Like, do I even need the lipid panel and just go with ApoB, right? Or do I need both, right? So those would be the standards in terms of measuring for CVD metabolic health.
Mm, right. How do you know that if you have? So let's say you're not very old. You're like maybe in your 40s or something, and you have low insulin. How do you know that it's not this phenotype of a 80-year-old who would also have low insulin?
Yeah. So if glucose is increasing, so if your glucose
Mm,
levels have increased over time, that's one sign that low insulin may be bad, right? Because you would want to have lower glucose, lower insulin, right? So, and especially if HbA1c is up in that situation too, that suggests that low insulin may be a sign of pancreatic dysfunction.
mm. What do you think that if with the blood sugar levels, like a lot of people say that you need to have very low blood sugar levels, and any rise in blood sugar is pathological and is promoting aging and a lot of the diseases. What do you think? Like, because obviously there's this like a sweet spot, like too low and too high of anything can be harmful. So if you have like zero glucose, then you're dead, and if it's too high, then you have diabetes. So like, what's the like? Where do you find like the sweet spot?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's a great question because I see that a lot online, even and not to rain on his parade, but just using Brian Johnson as an example, right? So he recently posted in one of his screenshots, his glucose, I think, was 75, right? So if you look at all-cause mortality risk in very big, large epidemiological studies, the one I have in mind is 12 million people. 80 to 94 for glucose was associated with lowest risk for all-cause mortality. So 75 would be at a significantly higher risk, right? So then it goes to your question of where's the sweet spot? Can 75 be optimal? And then how would you know? How would you know if 75 is on the wrong road, or is, in his case, 75 okay, right? So there's nuance in the details. So for example, at very old ages, centenarians, for example, they can have glucose levels that are less than 80. So what's going on there, right? Is that just they're super insulin sensitive and that's an aspect of their longevity? So the other side of that is that the liver is involved in gluconeogenesis. So when we're fasted, part of the liver's job is to make glucose to keep blood sugar levels stable, right? And around 80 milligrams per deciliter. So blood glucose levels in someone who's very old are 69, 73, 74. It could be a sign there is liver dysfunction. Okay, so then we go to Brian's liver enzymes, right? When I look at his AST and ALT, which follow a J-shaped curve with all-cause mortality risk, they're actually on the higher ascending portion.
Mm,
But then we can take that a step further because GGT, which is also a liver enzyme, is a more easily interpretable biomarker related to liver health and function when compared with AST and ALT, because it's basically linear. Lower is better, and as it increases, it's worse for all-cause mortality risk. So in his case, his GGT is very low. It's 8. It's fantastic. So now we've got this discordant data. AST and ALT is on that J, increasing J for all-cause mortality risk in terms of right, AST, ALT. But then his GGT is fantastic for liver. So then how do you square that circle? So in at least one study, head-to-head matchup with the highest 10% for GGT, the highest 10% of a population for AST and ALT. AST and ALT were associated with an increased risk of death for liver disease mortality, fourfold, but GGT was an eightfold higher. Now that suggests that GGT may be a more powerful biomarker of liver disease mortality. So just using Brian's glucose of 75 as an example, when considering that GGT could be a better biomarker relative to AST and ALT, the GGT suggests his liver function is great. So in that case, it's probably not a gluconeogenesis problem by the liver. His liver function is probably good. That 75, even though it would be on the small ascending portion of the J shape for increased all-cause mortality risk for glucose, probably good. And his HbA1c is below 5, which is also associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. But I bet that too is related to liver dysfunction, low blood glucose, low HbA1c, increased all-cause mortality risk below 5. But since his GGT is great, to me, it suggests that his glucose at 75 could be okay. So for people who have glucose less than 80, it's important not to think, oh, I'm great. I would evaluate that within the context of other biomarkers, especially like the liver.
Yeah, that's a good point that, there's a lot of nuance to this and a lot of other biomarkers that also kind of affect what the outcome could be. But you can find a lot of other examples about this as well, like low cholesterol, for example. That's one of the most popular examples that like low cholesterol is associated with higher mortality because of XYZ studies that do show that. But maybe you can explain like how does these other biomarkers actually, what do they mean in that context?
Yeah. So just before going to the LDL story, which is almost exactly a similar thing. So it's very easy to use the wrong study to interpret one's data. And I try not to use one study. I mean, that could be, it's what's the field? What's the overall, multitude of studies? Even just looking at a meta-analysis sometimes can be misleading because maybe the meta-analysis included sick or diabetic populations, right? So I try to get general population, very large epidemiological studies. So the ALT, AST study I have in mind had 16.6 million people. I mean, it's hard to get a bigger population-based average than that. But then, I hear people with the criticism, they'll say, well, most people are bad diets and overweight. But when you have 16.6 million people, all of them can't be on, can't be poor health, right? So, and that's the best that we can do, right? So in contrast, if you have a study of 1,000 people and, and someone says, oh, in this study, AST or ALT of 15 was lowest all-cause mortality risk. Yeah, but it's 1,000 people. Is that representative of the population versus I have a study of 16.6 million people, 15 is associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. It's the larger the sample size, it's basically the closer to the population-based average. The other side of that too is what's the follow-up for mortality risk, right? So for example, if you have a study of only 20,000 people, but the follow-up is 50 years, right? So you're following them for a very long period of time and then using biomarkers 50 years earlier to predict mortality risk. Versus if you have a study of 20,000 people and then the follow-up is 5 years, you're kind of looking at two different things, right? It's which is associated with short-term mortality versus which is associated with a longer 50-year, which is longevity, right? So it's important to have that context of what's the sample size of the study and then how long is the follow-up. I try to go after the longest follow-up with as big of a sample size that I can, but sometimes it's the opposite where you have 500,000 people in a 10-year follow-up. But then it's a juggling act, right? Is 500,000 people in a 10-year follow-up better than 20,000 people in a 50-year follow-up, right? So there is some interpretation to this, right? But not trying to extrapolate based on the published data and doing nothing, I think, it's flawed approach. All right, so the LDL story?
Yeah.
All right, so I should say too, just a quick shout out. I've got a 95-minute video on Patreon detailing all of this. So if anybody wants to see the papers and the references and me actually going through more of the story or the same story, it's on a special biomarker tier. So just to give that a quick shout out. So apologies for the self-promotion and plug. But
you also cover all biomarkers, right? What's the optimal range for them?
So there's 27 there for now. I'm going to build on that based on what I haven't already covered in that video, and continuously expand it over time. Right. So LDL also follows this inverse U during aging, where low in youth, peak in midlife, low in very advanced age. So it goes to this idea again of how can you know if it's low or advanced stage? So obviously you have two crowds, right? You have the one crowd who says lower LDL is better, as low as possible, right? There's that big online presence. And then you have the other side who say, look at 80-year-olds, these studies in 80-year-olds where higher total cholesterol, including LDL, is associated with lowest all-cause mortality risk, right? Which is true. Both can be true. In youth, you have low LDL, and in 80-year-olds, having higher LDL and total cholesterol is associated with lower risk of all-cause mortality. So there's a study of about 4.7 million people that was published, I think, last year that addressed this disparity. And part of it is comorbidity, right? So in most studies, when looking at the association for a biomarker with all-cause mortality risk, they'll include in their model factors that can impact that association. For example, age, sex, BMI, right? Glucose if they have it, other lipoproteins if they have it, and just stop there. But there are many comorbidities that can affect the association for just LDL in this case with all-cause mortality risk. Or pick your biomarker, right? It should be every biomarker assessed with all-cause mortality should address as many factors as possible that can affect that association, right? For example, just as a side note, right? It's like healthy user bias, right? Did the study adjust for physical activity, diet quality, in addition to BMI, age, sex, all of that, right? So if you leave that out and then somebody's showing that data, is that the story or just healthy user bias, right? It's hard to know without adjusting the model. So in the study that I have in mind of this 4.7 million people, where they looked at total cholesterol, LDL, triglycerides, and I think you cited it in your triglyceride video. That's where I got it from this paper too, where less than 45 for triglycerides, or maybe you didn't, I don't know, maybe it's just me. But anyway, so what they did was they adjusted their models sequentially. So the first model was like the standards, age, sex, BMI, and then you see an LDL of relatively higher, 120, was associated with like a 20% lowest CHD. They didn't look at all-cause mortality for LDL in this case. 120, 20% lower risk of coronary heart disease mortality risk. So that was the first model, age, sex, BMI, and I don't know, maybe hypertension. Model 2, they added a few more factors that could impact that association, and then the risk was reduced, which suggests that the other factors that they added to the model were contributing to the association for LDL with all-cause mortality risk. So now 120 was still associated with about a 10% lower risk, a significant 10% lower risk for CHD mortality. But then they added other covariates, for example, like dementia, it was 11 comorbidities that they added that aren't kidney disease, liver disease. I mean, these are things that are not commonly adjusted for that can impact the association for LDL with all-cause mortality risk. And when they did that 120 all of a sudden was not associated with all-cause mortality risk. And when using that model, 65 to 120 became the optimal range. And they have beautiful charts in the thing where adjusting for all 11 additional factors in addition to the standards, you can see that the risk sequentially was reduced. But then also note that less than 65 was associated with a small but significant CHD mortality risk, and then over 120 for LDL, also an increased all-cause mortality risk. So then I went back and looked, and this story again is on Patreon, at the study that shows, and it's in a very large epidemiological study. I think that study, it's 10 million people or some outrageous number, very high, where LDLs, I think it was of 130 to 190 lowest risk, and then above like 200 higher risk, and then below 120 higher risk, right? So how do you square that circle? Yeah, on the one hand, you have 65 to 120 lowest risk, and then on the other, you have anything less than 130 higher risk, right? So what it came down to for the study with the higher or lower LDL, higher risk, was that they only adjusted for age, sex, BMI, other CVD, related, were you diagnosed with pre-existing cardiovascular disease, and a couple other factors. They didn't have all of the comorbidities that can impact that association. Whereas in the study that did have it, of 4.7 million people, that risk dramatically reduced, which suggests that comorbidity was impacting the association. So at advanced stage, the long story short is, in advanced stage, LDL levels drop precipitously, in part because of liver dysfunction. So very high GGT is an example. So it makes sense now that people who are 80 years old or 90 years old that have higher total cholesterol probably have good liver function. They can make cholesterol relative to the people who are sick and on that road to death. Their liver function is poor or bad, can't make cholesterol, so they've got lower LDL. The people who have good liver function have higher LDL, and now it makes sense why, higher in that case is better. But I think it's a poor interpretation of the actual literature, and I think so that's one side. The other side of it too is when you consider that LDL is low in youth, and then it peaks at midlife. I could even make the argument that if your LDL is relatively high, it's aged. That's the aged phenotype, right?
Right.
Ideally, it's keeping it as low as possible for as long as possible. But then it also goes to that idea of how do I know if it's youthful or aged, right? So then looking at those other biomarkers, the other liver function and health biomarkers, even albumin, which is related to the liver. So if albumin is low and LDL is low, inflammation is high, it's probably a bad sign. And then last but not least, the thing about this whole story that's fascinating me the most lately is that comorbidity biomarker prediction. So prodromal, right? So the early incidence and predicting of a long-term negative health outcome. So how do you know if you were at your LDL had increased during aging and now, it's starting to decrease. And now you're on that slow sloping road to death. And just that, I know I can talk forever, Siim, sorry, but it's good for business, right? When the guest talks forever. But when you look at just bringing this back to like fitness and leanness and bodybuilding and all that stuff, right? When you look at like the GOATs, Frank Zane, Arnold in his day, I can go through the list, right? Big, ripped, lean. You look at them at 70 and 80, WTF? What happened? What's going on there? You can't tell me that these guys aren't motivated, or, okay, maybe there's a segment of the people, who were lean and fit and huge at one point, and then they're like, I just don't want to be like that anymore, right? Okay, fine. But then there's also going to be a segment where they want to be healthy forever, right? And then, okay, I'm conflating bodybuilding with health, but Frank Zane was never the super freaky, huge, a Cutler and Ronnie Coleman, right? It was always a lean aesthetic. You look at Frank Zane now, no disrespect to Frank Zane, but Frank Zane now does not look like he did. So there's some underlying, this is my speculation, there's some underlying pathology that goes on that makes it difficult to be able to maintain that lean, ripped aesthetic indefinitely. When does it change? Is it at 65? Is it at 70? What's the biochemical process inherent in that? And can we catch it early so that at 90 now we can look like Frank Zane or pick your bodybuilder of choice, right? So that's a big part of where I'm after now, of identifying that biochemical phenotype early and resisting that as early as possible so I can be lean and ripped indefinitely and never, succumb to that age-related, now I just look like an old man, right? So,
right. Yeah. Well, that, the 70-year-old Polish guy, the Vyacheslav, well, he's like super ripped, but he's probably taking some TRT, I suspect.
But that's the small part of it. But if you look at his physique compared to like Frank, the guy is fit. I know who you're talking about. He's fit. He looks good for his age. He looks just like a fit guy, right? Even on TRT, he looks fit. Granted, Frank Zane, those guys probably on steroids back then too. And I'm not saying carrying that much muscle is optimal for longevity and resisting aging. But even like Jack LaLanne, I don't know if you're familiar with Jack LaLanne, but Jack LaLanne was, fit and aesthetic and lean. And when you look at Jack in his 90s, it's just, this slow walking, poor, slow gait, 95-year-old man. This is one of the most highly motivated people that has ever lived, would say things like, I can't die, it'll be bad for my image. Swimming like, hundreds of miles at like 70 to prove he's super fit at that age. And then all of a sudden it changes. There's some biochemical phenotype in that. And I don't think it's just aging. I think a big part of this is cachexia, whether it's cancer related or just the physiological decay that accompanies cachexia of not just sarcopenia, where it's lean mass wasting, but it's also fat mass that declines towards end of life. And all of the tissue dysfunction that's associated with cachexia too. So I'm deep down that hole now and trying to figure out, what are the biomarkers of this cachexic phenotype where you're just decaying, you're still alive, but you're basically literally dying and decaying and decomposing over a 10 or 15 year period.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, like and it actually ties in with the like cholesterol and mortality risk as well. So like one additional thing that you see with low cholesterol is malnutrition. So if you're malnourished and undereating, or like anorexic, or yeah, like an elderly person who's 80 years old and they're super underweight and frail, they also have malnutrition. And they're not eating, and they also have low cholesterol. So this is another this comorbidity that lowers your cholesterol quite a lot. And if you have frailty, malnutrition, and you also have low cholesterol, you're not dying to the low cholesterol, although you have low cholesterol. You're dying to like the frailty and malnutrition, right? So that kind of skews the data again. So if you are like not malnourished, you have good muscle mass and good fitness, then the low cholesterol isn't the bad thing. It's probably like better than having high cholesterol at that situation. And if you have frailty and like let's say like sarcopenia and low muscle mass and those things, then yeah, maybe if you have high cholesterol, it just means that you're not under nutritioned. Like you're just eating enough, specifically like maybe animal protein or something, which prevents you from becoming malnourished and sarcopenic, and that prevents you from dying. Like you have the adequate muscle tissue and just body weight that prevents you from dying to falls or something like that. But if you stop eating, your cholesterol goes down, your muscle mass and all bone density goes down, then you probably like died to some of these like wasting diseases.
But which is it, cause or consequence, right? Is it quote unquote, and then even defining malnourished can be debatable, right? I mean,
Right.
it's like, do we have the prescription now? Is your diet or my diet giving me all of the nutrients I need to be on the slowest aging rate, right? And then, when you hear even like Dunedin pace, just as an example, that's including an epigenetic prediction of like VO2 max, waist to hip ratio, visceral fat as an indirect predictor. It's got the CVD biomarkers, glucose. It's got inflammation, HbA1c, HSCRP, and it's got so metabolic health, right? But it leaves out blood pressure. It leaves out lung function. It's got kidney. It's got kidney there. I think cystatin C. But what I'm trying to say is that you know we could technically all be somewhat malnourished, just at different degrees, right? And then play that out over a 50-year period. Now are we just, it's that, okay, maybe it's not a 1% loss of muscle mass per year or whatever that rate is, but, it's a smaller rate now for people who are actually trying to be fully nourished and optimal nutrition. But play that forward 50 years and now you still look malnourished because it's still, you've reduced the rate, but it's still, you've delayed it, right? So I don't know which comes first there, whether, I think the malnourished, it's actually the other, that's the, uh, I, people in that state are basically the comorbid state where they're decaying. I think, they'll take like the malnourished that they're doing is basically they're looking at like albumin levels and saying, oh, this person is malnourished. I don't think it's just that simple to say, eat more calories, your albumin goes up. I don't have that experience. Like there are specific things in my data that are correlated with albumin, and calorie intake is not one of them. And actually other clients I work with, calorie intake not associated with albumin, just as an example. So although malnourished can be defined as low albumin, I'm not sure that that's a diet thing or a comorbidity thing where it's just, you've got this underlying pathology, whether it's liver cancer that leads to less albumin in blood, and now you qualify in the malnourished phenotype, or it's a specific and or the combination of poor diet and you're really malnourished and it leads to, the frailty phenotype. But it does that go to is, Arnold and Frank Zane and these Jacqueline, these bodybuilders, are they just somewhat malnourished for decades and they end up looking like they do at 80 versus when they looked at 40? I mean, I don't know how that's. Arnold now has changed his diet from what I've seen, and he hasn't reverted his body type back to where it was, right? So there's more going on there.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, so elucidating that, I mean, it's just a matter of quantifying, right? It's just a matter of seeing the patterns in the matrix and identifying which biomarkers and tracking that and making sure I try to catch it sooner than later. That's atop my list now. So just another quick add on that story. I don't know if you saw the paper where the 1 day of fasting, 2 days of fasting, 20% and 40% CR in mice, and they looked at lifespan. So anyway, they heavily mapped so many biomarkers in association with longevity. And the long story short there was that even for the mice that were 40% or 20% CR, all the groups, towards about the last 25% of life, all of them losing body weight.
Mm.
Like, so this is a definite, and it happens in people too. There's a definite physiological and biochemical phenotype that's going on for some fraction towards the end of life that's worse than aging, right?
Mm.
Aging is you're getting worse, you were getting worse, 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 and then the shit hits the fan, and it's just you're just decomposing while you're still alive. So
Mm. Yeah.
I'm not just trying to resist aging. I'm trying to resist that decomposition phase too, where it's, now it's two things we've got to fight: conquer aging and I don't know what I would call it, the cachexia,
Mhm.
or,
Wasting.
so yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like you see, older people are very like becoming smaller versions of themselves and wasting away. Do you think like some of these blood markers can be useful for like assessing biological age as well? I know there's like the pheno age clock that uses a certain few of these blood markers to calculate biological age. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so pheno age is a good clock. So I actually made a video recently of how good is it, looking at its correlation with chronological age and then all-cause mortality risk. The correlation with chronological age, people do have some problem with that because it includes chronological age in its model. Nonetheless, even if you take that out, you take out the cutesy number and just look at year-to-year change, if your biomarkers all stay the same, pheno age will increase by 0.9 years per year. So it's not just about, I think a lot of people, not to just call out Brian, but, will say my biological age is X, and they'll cite one test or two tests. This is not how it should be done, in my opinion. It's year to year change, multiple tests per year, and then tracking it for a long period of time. So even if pheno age isn't perfect because it has chronological age in its model, it is associated with all-cause mortality risk, right? An older pheno age, a higher all-cause mortality risk. And I've got a video coming out soon on menopause as an example. So an older biological age, earlier age at menopause, shorter life expectancy. So it is an important, and there's a multitude of other studies that show its importance in association with like COVID-related deaths. So it's an important tool, but year-to-year change for just pheno age, I see value there. But then the other side of it there is, for people who have issues with quote unquote biological age clocks, and I'm not talking about epigenetics. I may agree with some of those criticisms, or most of them, but for the actual biomarker-based clocks where, in pheno age, it's albumin, hsCRP, glucose, white blood cells, which biomarkers are people having a problem with in that set, right? And then knowing how those biomarkers change during aging and then plotting them each individually. Are you resisting age-related changes, right? Albumin declines during aging precipitously, right? So if was your albumin 5 grams per deciliter at 20, and 20 years later, is it still 5? Okay, you're doing a good job of resisting its age-related change, right? So I try not to focus too much on the singular biological age metric. It's a cutesy number. It's, I don't want to say it's clickbait. It's not, because again, it is related to clinical based outcomes. But I find the most value tracking year to year change, not just for the biological age tool, but each of the individual biomarkers. But then you can expand that, right? So the biomarkers of liver health and kidney health and lung function and blood pressure, year to year change for all of them. And then showing, so I'm planning on showing that data in videos at some point. How well or how not, where are weak spots, where are strengths, and showing that approach, because I think a lot of the field is just so hyper focused on, this is my Dunedin pace. And man, one test over 365 days is representative. I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, because there's a lot of variation. Can be like fluke test. Like I've measured a few like inflammatory markers, and they can be sometimes just very high because of whatever reason, and then you do it a few weeks later and it's down to normal. So yeah, like a lot of markers, if you measure them only like once, you might not get the full picture, and they can change quite rapidly.
But then it gets to how many times per year can you minimize that variability, right? So
Mm.
around every test, I have a standardization approach. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, if you did a hard workout and you blood test the next day, that's probably what led to the elevated inflammatory markers on the next day. So knowing that, my last workout is 2 to 3 days before every blood test, standardized. Like it isn't 5 days away. It's not 1 day away. Every test, 2 to 3 days, sometimes 4 days before the test, no hard workouts. So that doesn't mean no exercise for the 2 to 3 to 4 days before the test, but just titrating activity downward so that the overtrained phenotype is not impacting the blood test results. And then obviously hydration before the test. So if you go into the test and haven't drank any water, and then you're just happen to be more hydrated that day or less hydrated versus an earlier test, that can affect the results too, right? So as soon as I wake up, 20 ounces of water, and then I try to test exactly at the same time every test, 7:30 to 8, for every test going back years, to try to minimize time of day and hydration status, their impact on biomarkers. But then also the fasting window, right? Like, just what's recommended is, say, an overnight fast. But for some people, that's 8 hours, could be 12 hours. Maybe I fast for 17 hours, right? The fasting window could potentially, and I say could potentially because I don't know, right? I'd have to do the experiment, and that's a whole different, I need a different Michael Lustgarten to run these experiments. I can't do them all myself, right? So I've standardized the fasting window where early on in 2015, it was like 17 hours. So I just was like, I'm just going to stick to it. For every test, 17 to 18 hour window, no food, some water, but so for every test, standardizing fasting window, hydration status morning of the test, exercise, the last hard workout before testing, and that can help minimize some of that test to test variability. In my case, my data is not variable at all. And if I see a spike in something, then I'm like, okay, something I did was out of whack. I just have to figure out what it was.
Yeah, that's a good tip, that try to do things the same way around the tests. Like, they can be more accurate that way. And, over time you will get like some sense of what things are more like normal and what kind of things vary quite more often.
But then that goes to the issue of how many tests per year do you need to really get a full representation of what your data actually is? Because if it's only once per year, and then you fast forward that, and then something pops up crazy, then what? Then does someone start testing to try to figure out if that's aberrant data or not? And then maybe it's too late at that point, right? So I'm not saying it has to be 8 tests like me. I do work with a client who does 12 tests or more. And sometimes it's like, for things like urine, I mean, you can do that all the time. 50 tests over a few months, but testing enough where you can say, this is where my data usually is over some period of time, I think is huge, a huge part of this story. For example, I'll give you another quick story. HRV resting heart rate is another good one, because just like blood pressure and lung function, I don't have to pull blood, right? So my data had been, and obviously not as good as yours yet. I mean, I don't know if my data was like yours at your age, but for my chronological, and I hate to be in that boat. I hate to be in the boat of, for my chronological age, it's good, but it's not where yours is, right? But in time, we'll see if I can get it back there. But so 6742, heart rate variability, resting heart rate. Good for my chronological age. So that's where it was for a couple of years. And then summer last year, all of a sudden, HRV is starting to go down, and resting heart rate starting to go up. Nighttime respiratory rate starting to go up. I mean, this is like deep sleep starting to go down. So I'm like, and this was going on for 8 months. So I'm like, what is this aging? It's the mind F of, is this where it goes? Is this the end? Have I run my run, and now I'm on that cachexia thing, and that's it, right? So I've been using earplugs, silicone earplugs, and I'm convinced this is what it is, because so silicone earplugs, because I live on a busy street in Boston. I mean, I live across the street from the fire department, the police cars at all hours of the night. There are bums on the street yelling at 2 a.m. There are party type people like, woo, right? Earplug. I have to, so. But the problem with that is, after a couple of days, they would smell, and I thought nothing of it. I just shove them back on my ears, and I'd change them out. I'm not a dirtbag where I'm using the same earplugs for months. Every 3-4 days, take a new one, right? So in late last month, my ear basically blew up. Like, I'm talking blew up. I took pictures. I may show this in a video at some point, but blew up. I've never had this ever. We're like completely red, swollen. So and it was from earplug. It had to be from the earplugs. So I stopped using the earplugs. Now, and I should say too that my heart rate variability, resting heart rate, when my ear blew up, looked like immune activation after vaccination. And for the people who are anti-vaccination, that's your thing. It was forced by work. I didn't have a choice. That's a whole different discussion, right? But immune activation after vaccination spiked my nighttime respiratory rate, tanked HRV, increased resting heart rate. It was only for 2 days I recovered. But the ear infection did the same thing to those data that immune activation following vaccination. So it did something to me systemically. Now, if we backtrack those 8 months and, probably it was subclinical where, there's a smell on the earplugs. So it was probably, a moist environment for microbial, additional microbial growth. Some of that may have leaked into my blood over an 8-month period,
Wow.
making all of those data worse. Now, okay, so now I stopped the earplugs, which sucks because I'm getting awakened by these clowns on the street every night, which is terrible. Anyway, so the last 2 days, 68-40, 2 of the last 3 days around a workout, 68-40, 66-41. And also my recoveries post-workout have been slowed where it's taken like 2, 3, 4, 5 days to get back to just even like 55-44, which is to me age data. I hadn't had data like that in 4 or 5 years. The long story short is no earplugs. My body is finally starting to recover to this thing that I did to it. But if I wasn't tracking it long term over time, who knows what kind of systemic damage I would have done, So anyway.
That's very interesting.
Trying to catch it early, right?
Yeah. I had maybe not this very similar story, but on the same realm that I stayed at a hotel that had a bit of mold, and then I saw my inflammatory marker, the TNF alpha, was elevated, and now it's low normal again. So even some mold exposure in whatever place when you're traveling or something, that can also kind of cause a short term a spike in some of these different markers.
The thing is, if it's like a subclinical dose, in that case, it was an acute dose. You saw the effect immediately. But imagine if the amount of mold, where you live or wherever it may be, you've got that, slowly impacting your data over a long period of time. And you had physiological metrics that told you something's wrong. But the only way you would know something's wrong is if you had so much data to actually know what TF is going on here. This is not normal. Right. So, anyway, it took my ear blowing up basically super red and giant to say something. And the only thing that was causing that was literally earplugs. As soon as I took the earplugs were in that night. And when it blew up, and I was like, it's got to be the earplugs. So imagine if I didn't have that problem and I wouldn't have known this and I'd continue using it for years, perpetually making myself worse and worse. Who knows what kind of, and maybe I did some damage I can't undo because of that 8-month period.
Right. Yeah. What do you think about the heavy metals? So you can also measure them in the blood, and excess heavy metals are kind of harmful. Do you measure them, and how do you prioritize them?
Yeah, wait, I'll answer that, I promise. But going back to TNF alpha, that's I recently measured that too. I hadn't measured it in a long time. TNF alpha, IL-6 are part of the senescence associated secretory phenotype. They're 2 of the pro-inflammatory cytokines that increase during aging, in part because the senescence associated secretory phenotype increases during aging. So senescent cells increase during aging. So those are on my radar for tracking at every test. Because if you're not tracking markers of senescent cells, we're just basically, right? It's a mechanism we may be missing with the standard biomarker. So in my case, TNF alpha, IL-6 below the detection limit. So I'm not going to measure them again. I'll probably do that once a year. And if I start to see that above the detection limit, then it's 8 times a year. I'm not messing around. Got to figure out the recipe to keep it low. Heavy metals. So I have measured lead. Lead was below the detection limit. I don't know if that's because of the water filter that I use, but I do eat cacao beans, which I have, and I make my own chocolate. Cocoa beans are well known to have lead. So, but I don't eat them that much that could spike lead. But nonetheless, my lead levels were below the detection limit. I haven't measured the others like cadmium or arsenic. I eat a lot of sardines, so maybe arsenic could be high. At some point, I'll add the others. But for now, lead is low, which is good news.
Yeah. There was a recent report protein powders are quite high in lead, most of them. So that's unfortunate. I use some protein powders quite regularly, and it's unfortunate. A lot of cacao can have heavy metals, fish, water that you drink and those things. So yeah,
Have you
I think
measured?
it's definitely like worthwhile to kind of test heavy metals.
Definitely. Have you measured lead? Was your lead?
It was like a little bit higher than it should be, but it hadn't been in the past when I was also using protein powder. So I don't know, like maybe I changed something else, but or maybe I was just using too much protein powder or a different brand. I don't know specifically, but I didn't know exactly what would be the reason why it would be high. Maybe the protein powder, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'll like change it up and measure it again in a few months.
Yeah, so along those lines, back when I was doing protein powders, I was getting, and I'm not affiliated, I'm not sponsored by them, but a Naked Whey, just trying to avoid all of the chemical additives that are added to protein powders just in general.
Mm.
So Naked Whey was literally just grass-fed, uh, whey, right? But then you could even get into the idea of, rabbit holes, man, rabbit holes. So, you know, uh, denatured, right? Concentrate, like which version is going to be best absorbed. So I'm minimizing the ability of it to not get fully absorbed, and then it makes it to my colon, which is then fermented into metabolites that can negatively impact health. Protein fermentative bacterial metabolites are not good for health. So anyway, without going down that rabbit hole, I had Naked Whey, but there's no additives, right? So it tastes terrible. I have to add it. I had to add it to stuff, but even then, the taste wasn't great. So there's a balance there between, Naked Whey, no additives, probably no lead or very low lead, and what can
Yeah,
you add to,
yeah, need to add some berries or something,
but a
cacao.
lot.
Mm. Yeah. Um, yeah, maybe we can then like okay, let's say you have like some unlimited budget and you have access to all the tests in the world, and we don't have to start naming like all these hundreds of tests that you would do, but what would be like a general overview of like if you had like the best testing capability, what would you like test in categories like?
Yeah, I don't think it will be as expensive as most people say. Like,
Mm.
so again, starting from the top, right? The body composition and physical function. So DEXA, once a year. So that's depending on where you go in the US, it can be 100 USD, somewhere in that ballpark. VO2 max can be $50 USD test. I mean, grip strength, or even just tracking your own strength and performance during workouts. So my workouts are standardized. I don't change it up. I do a variety of movements, through a variety of different planes. I'm not just in the, standard plane. I'm doing spinning and rotation. I'm trying to optimize mobility, flexibility, balance, all these things too, not just strength. Granted, I'm not as big as you, but anyway, the point is I track sets, reps, strength for all of the compound movements. So I could catch functional decrements as soon if they happen, right? So even if someone's not paying to go do a VO2 max, you can track in workout performance for a very long period of time and see if your performance has stayed the same. There's more is better, right? And I always have to get stronger. I always have to get fitter. There's a cap. We all have a genetic limit, right? For me, there is a win in maintenance, right? Now you could say if you're just maintaining, you're going to get worse. But for sure, always the goal is to optimize. But maintaining is a win in my eyes. So top tier, right? Even just that standard $35 test. Now you're doing the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, liver, kidney, metabolic health. Add in the HSCRP, we're at $80. Cystatin C, probably a big one for older ages because creatinine levels can be higher because of poor kidney function and lower because of less muscle mass. But then you could add other stuff into that kidney function equation like BUN, uric acid, which increase when kidney function is bad. So even if creatinine is not a good marker, you've got those two cheap markers that are included on the $35 USD test. Um, other inflammatory markers, even adding TNF, IL-6, those are expensive. But if, like I said, if you're below the detection limit, I wouldn't do it 8 times a year. But just the standards, I mean, just like I said, you've got, and then a blood pressure cuff, that's, $100. The lung function meter, that's, 150. For 100, just the standard blood test alone, $100 can go very far from, metabolic health, kidney, liver. One doesn't have to go through the metabolomics or epigenetics to get a lot of value for their money, while also focusing on the top tier, function and leanness, right? So I think a lot can be done for a lot less than people think. then the question is, would I need a $2,000 or more MRI once a year, right? Would that be better than looking at the biomarkers 8 times a year? I think having an MRI is probably important. I don't know the testing frequency there yet. Looking at actual atherosclerosis buildup, so carotid ultrasound, probably important at least once a year, just to see if there's any plaque and progression over time. And if there is plaque, then, and I haven't done this yet, I'm guilty there. My rationale is, and it's probably weak, but eventually I'll have to include the carotid ultrasound. But my rationale is my lipoproteins have been low, relatively low for decades. So I should be at low risk. CRP is less than the detection limit for 3 years in a row, 20 something plus tests. I should be at low risk for CVD, but having the actual biomarker measure, and that's not an expensive test. It's like 150 USD, the ultrasound. So the big question is the therapeutics, right? So, which quote unquote advanced therapies will quote unquote rejuvenate, right? How expensive will that be? Will it even make a dent? That to me is the big black box of longevity.
Mm. Yeah, because you could spend thousands and tens of thousands of dollars on that, but I think like most of the valuable information comes from the kind of 80-20 kind of a principle, that some of the very fundamental markers, and we also have to realize what we don't know. Yes, there's all these markers, but we don't necessarily know how do they, if at all, they would actually predict longevity. And maybe in 5 to 10 years we'll have more understanding about it. But up until that point, you might not need to spend a ton of money on more like fringe or let's say more experimental markers, and just focus on the kind of basic fundamentals.
Yeah. So even though there aren't clinical trials that say based on this biomarker profile, this is how long you're going to live. I mean, to me, it just makes the most sense that if all of your, organ and systemic function biomarkers are what you'd expect to find in youth and are associated with lowest all-cause mortality risk, that's the best we can do, right? You're literally squeezing the genetic orange in terms of how long you'll live. Like if your genetic max was 80, you'll get to 80, maybe not 60, right? Or genetic max 100, maybe you get to 80. So, that's the best we can do with things like HBOT or, red light or hydrogen water. I mean, I don't know what the ROI is on these things yet, but even there, I'd want to see biomarker changes. Show me some, outcome measure that improves in response to these things. Otherwise, it's just placebo, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been great talking with you, and we'll probably have to do like a follow-up in the future. But where can people learn more about you and your work?
Cool. Thanks, Siim. Anytime. Conquer aging or die trying. I'm all over the interwebs. Reach out if you want to know more.
Yeah, and where can people learn the Patreon as well?
Patreon.com, Michael Lustgarten. Just do a Google search. Find me.
All right. We'll put the links in the show notes. But it was a great talking with you. I usually ask what's the one piece of advice we wish you adopted sooner, but you've answered it already several times. So unless if that's changed.
Yeah, but maybe I didn't answer it directly. It's track, right? It's, track as much as you can. I know it can be rigorous for most people. Like for example, tracking diet. Most people don't want to do that, or even tracking supplements, right? There's got to be. It can't just be biomarkers. It's got to be, how do I know what's impacting these things? And in order to do that, you need data, right? You need to have some tracked information. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of guesswork trying to figure out what's causing what, right? So, track.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Well, thanks for coming, and I'll see you around.
Ciao.
All right, that's it for this episode. Make sure you check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. I'd also appreciate if you share this episode with a friend or family member. Other than that, my name is Siim. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay empowered.